This is part 1 of the reading of chapter 3 of the book Rockefeller Medicine Men, Medicine and Capitalism in America. Chapter 3. Scientific Medicine Part 2. The Preservation of Capital. Scientific medicine, while providing well for the medical profession, also posed a major and unresolvable contradiction for doctors. Medical science, as it developed in capitalist countries, was built up around technology. The higher the level of technology, it was believed, the more effective or at least saleable were the services of practitioners and researchers. But the higher the level of technology, the more capital was required for medical practice as well as for research. Investments in hospital and laboratory facilities and tremendous expenses for highly specialized faculty and researchers were beyond the resources of physicians themselves. Doctors had to turn outside the profession for capital, and in 1900 there was only one class who had such money. Wealthy capitalists were in a position to dictate terms to the profession, policies that served their own interest as much as or even more than those of the profession itself. In this chapter, we will see how medical science opened the door to capitalist intervention and the ways scientific medicine served not only the needs of the medical profession, but the interests of capitalism as well. Medical technology and capital. The 19th century family doctor owned a few instruments: specula, a thermometer, a stethoscope for examinations, saws for amputations, a chest of medicines to be sold to their patients. A small investment indeed. But 20th century medicine required greater technology than any single physician could afford. Hospitals, once the institutions to which the poor were taken to die, became the workshop for the doctor. Not only did the hospital provide the doctor with fully equipped operating rooms, x-ray machines, and other diagnostic and therapeutic instruments, it also provided auxiliary personnel who would isolate patients from their families, place them under control of technical experts, and ensure that the doctor's orders were carried out. Just as the buggy carrying the doctor to the patient's house symbolized the 19th century doctor-patient relationship, the patient in the doctor's moderately equipped office and then the doctor and patient in the hospital symbolized the modernized counterparts. Large-scale development of hospitals in the 1890s followed the development of surgery as a specialized skill. The renowned surgical skills of Halsted at St. John the renowned surgical skills of Halsted at Johns Hopkins and of others at the Mayo Clinic provided popular support for the profession's pleas that hospitals with modern surgical facilities be built. Rosemary Stevens notes, most of the hospitals now in existence were founded between 1880 and 1920, and the middle class for the first time entered hospitals on a large scale. In 1873, there were only 178 hospitals in the United States. By 1909, there were 4,359 hospitals with a total bed capacity of 421,000. Physicians grew increasingly dependent on hospitals. By 1929, 7 out of 10 physicians had some kind of hospital affiliation. In New York and Chicago, the average physician, whether generalist or specialist, spent as much as 30% of his or her time in hospitals and clinics. Even by the turn of the century, the medical profession was growing dependent on expensive institutionalized technology. The capital needed for hospitals, medical education, and research was beyond the means of the profession itself. A fully equipped, medium-sized hospital was an expensive building project. Then, too, room and service charges could not reasonably be expected to pay for the annual costs of running the hospital, especially when hospitals were free of charge workshops for the doctor. Patients could be expected to pay a certain amount for their hospital care, but beyond a very vaguely determined limit, any additional hospital charges would reduce utilization and cut into revenues of both hospital and physician. Thus, each year, hospitals accumulated deficits that had to be paid off. Deficit financing reflected the social role of hospitals as charitable institutions. Historically, from their development as medieval refuges for the disease poor to their more recent role of providing for the sick of all classes, hospitals have consistently reflected the class structure of the society. Fitting their position in the class structure, the rich have been expected to pay the complete costs of their own private space and attentive care. The middle classes, with less commodious facilities and fewer staff to attend to their wants, have been expected to pay their own costs, but not necessarily to support all aspects of the hospital. The poor, until recently, have been expected to pay in accord with their means, and that has been very little. Their care has been categorized as charity and consistent with widespread notions of the importance of work and the slothfulness of the poor. The facilities and care provided for them have been austere at their best and humiliating at their worst. Furthermore, with the association of increasing number of hospitals with medical schools, the poor have become the profession's research and teaching material. To complete the differentiation of class relations reflected within the hospital, as well as to balance the hospital books, the rich have been called upon to give money to hospitals to pay the cost of care given to the poor. The charitable nature of hospitals gives wealthy people an almost perfect opportunity to demonstrate their noblesse oblige within an institution that publicly reflects and thus reinforces the class structure of society. The organization and financing of hospitals clearly provides physicians with the facilities to practice their profession and make money, and it benefits the upper middle class and upper classes by providing them with facilities consistent with their social status and opportunities to demonstrate their superior class positions through charity to the hospital. The dependence of the medical profession on the wealthy could create antagonism, but with their compatible interest in the hospital, their relationship has been symbiotic. Local wealthy men and women open their hearts and loosen their purse strings to hospital fundraisers. Medical research and medical education were different issues. Hospitals appealed to a local constituency, whereas the new scientific medical schools drew their students and faculty from at least the state and more often a whole region or even the nation. Medical research was a long-term investment in developing new knowledge and technology that would serve the country as a whole rather than provide a subordinating service to the poor. Medical faculty and researchers were no longer local physicians of distinction. Their reputations were made nationally within their own ranks, or not at all. Local rich men and women would be cajoled into providing a laboratory at their nearby medical school through appeals to local pride, but these objects of charity lacked the drama of hospitals serving the poor and providing facilities for physicians known throughout the local community. Medical education and medical research involved much larger sums of money than hospitals' construction, and the endowments to support faculty and researchers required still larger investments out of the wealth of the local upper class. The combination of the larger sums required, the less directly charitable and less visible functions of medical research and education, the long-term investments they represented, and the more national character of their appeal made medical education and medical research the philanthropic objects of a national wealthy class more than of those whose wealth was local in its character or size. By the 1890s, a new national capitalist class overshadowed the local business and aristocratic elites. Their wealth was derived from investments in national corporations, and their vision of what was good and necessary for society were broader than their local and lesser counterparts. Many of them gave without strategy in their benefactions, except the courting of goodwill, but some had strategies and interests of their own. Just as well-connected local physicians appealed to local pride and charitable obligations of the local upper middle class to build a modern hospital for their community, so did academic physicians and medical scientists to turn to men and women of broader wealth with appeals to the needs of society. A few illustrious centers of medical education and research were relatively well off. Charles Eliot clearly saw that the way to attract large gifts and endowments was to reform Harvard's medical school. Johns Hopkins willed a hospital and medical school as well as a general university from his Baltimore and Ohio Railroad fortune, yet more was needed and gotten from the wealthy individuals to open the medical school. These cases were the exceptions. Not half a dozen institutions have received any considerable sums, and very few anything at all, the AMA Journal complained in 1900. The endowments necessary to advancing medical education and medical science must come from outside the profession. As some reform leaders foresaw and feared, there was danger in dependence on philanthropy for that capital. Welch, a Rockefeller medicine man. William H. Welch's personal plight and eventual success are indicative of the rising star of medical research. Returning in 1878 from his pathology studies in Germany, Welch found little support in New York for devoting himself to laboratory research. Although he received mild encouragement from Francis Delafield at a prestigious college of physicians and surgeons, he could not find any space in which to set up a laboratory. Finally, he turned to the lesser-rated Bellevue Hospital Medical College and negotiated the use of 3 rooms, some kitchen tables, and $25 in equipment. With frogs gathered from the marshes of his sister's upstate New York home, Welch began the first laboratory course in pathology given in an American medical school. He got by with fees and from his 6 students, a partnership with another doctor preparing medical students for competitive examinations, and assisting Dr. Austin Flint, a rich and socially prominent professor of medical practice at Bellevue. Welch's European studies and original work brought him immediate recognition. Within a year, the alumni of the College of Physicians and Surgeons contributed enough money to offer Welch a modest pathology laboratory at their alma mater. But Welch felt a commitment to Bellevue and also wanted to hold out for the security and completeness of the chair in the pathology at the new Johns Hopkins Medical School. Drawn by the more academic environment at Hopkins, relief from the drudgery of teaching, and endowed $4,000 a year salary and paid assistance, Welch shocked the New York medical profession and friends by giving up a future income of at least $20,000 for provincial Baltimore. Welch took the position at Hopkins in 1884. Before going to Baltimore, he spent most of the year studying bacteriology in Leipzig, and in Berlin with Koch, he studied bacteriology largely because he feared he would be left behind in the growing competition for medical discoveries. Welch's singular devotion to his career brought him success. Despite an adulation and social popularity he received, he isolated himself from personal intimacy with any other person, male or female. Welch's reputation as a researcher and organizer of research grew even before the Johns Hopkins Medical School opened its doors in 1893 with Welch as the first dean. By the turn of the century, Welch's professional reputation began spilling over into lay circles. In 1901, he came to the attention of Frederick T. Gates, the Grand Master of the Rockefeller Philanthropies. Welch was asked to help organize the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. He soon became chief advisor to the Rockefeller Foundations on medical projects, assisting in important ways in funding medical education in the United States and China, in developing public health programs in the United States and around the world, in organizing and heading this country's first school of public health, and more. In 1930, his 80th birthday was honored around the world with a live radio broadcast throughout the United States and Europe, presided over by President Hoover, and simultaneous celebrations in major cities in Europe and Japan. William W. Welch was indeed a man whose life and career spanned the fortunes of medical science from its struggling infancy to its prodigious material success. His life combined the perfect mix of ambition, talent, single-minded dedication, and opportunity to make him the ideal academic medicine in the United States. His gregariousness and wit kept him from being a recluse that his rejection of intimate relationships might have otherwise encouraged. His considerable talent combined with his initially almost frantic ambition to give him a competitive edge in medicine. Nevertheless, these qualities would have yielded few rewards had the opportunities not come at the right moments. If Welch had not been born a white male into a prosperous class, he would never have had the material support he needed. If Welch had been born 50 years earlier, there would have been no support for scientific medicine. If he had been born 50 years later, he might as well have been just another competent medical researcher. If Johns Hopkins Medical School had not been filling its faculty slots when he was ascending star in New York medical science, he might have been forced to divert energy into a lucrative private practice and lost his singular immersion in medical academia. If the Rockefeller philanthropies had not sought to develop scientific medical research, to reform medical education, and to develop public health programs, he might not have had a sufficient vehicle for his talents and might not have had his reputation as a world statesman and celebrity. While Welch was the right person at the right place at the right time, his spectacular career depended upon more than luck. His sex, race, and social class were crucial conditions for his success. But the development of corporate capitalism was perhaps the most important condition because it provided the ideological and cultural support for scientific medicine and the material support for his research. It is likely that Welch would have fared even even without the Rockefeller, since his reputation would have enabled him to skim off the best positions in medical science. Medical research and education as a whole, however, were helped immensely by the wealth of the Rockefeller fortune. Under the skillful direction of foundation officers, the Rockefeller wealth became the largest single source of capital for the development of medical science in the United States, the conversion of medical education to scientific research basis, and the development of public health programs in the United States and abroad. For the first quarter of the 20th century, the Rockefeller officers developed a definite strategy for their capital investment in medicine. The strategy sometimes supported and often opposed different interests in medicine, but such alliances and conflicts were never accidents on the part of the foundation. They were anticipated and necessary consequences of the role of modern medicine in the society, as desired and articulated from the very pinnacles of the American class structure. Why was so much Rockefeller money, $65 million in 1928, lavished on a single institution devoted to scientific medical research? What motivated the men at the Rockefeller philanthropy to spend so much of their energy and money on medicine? How important were their humanitarian feelings for their fellow human beings? Did they envision material benefits from their work? As capitalists and corporate managers, did they believe it would further their personal interests and their class interests? The self-consciousness of their pioneering effort made accessible the concerns and thinking behind the facades constructed in foundation-funded histories and authorized biographies. Rockefeller Money and Medical Science, a Social Investment. On June 2, 1901, New York's newspapers hailed the founding of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. The most celebrated example of private philanthropy-supported medical research, the Institute began a new epoch in the United States. More than its predecessors abroad, the Rockefeller Institute would attack a broad range of diseases, seeking understandings of their biological and chemical causes, developing methods of prevention and cure, and training hundreds of researchers for medical science. The Institute began modestly with a commitment of $20,000 a year for research grants, and soon after, an outright gift of $1 million from John Davison Rockefeller. By 1928, gifts to the Institute totaled $65 million, an enormous sum for the period. Although the elder Rockefeller and his son are most widely known for the benefactions. It was Frederick T. Gates who formulated the strategies and initiated the investments in medical research, medical education, and public health. In 1915, Gates set down his memories of the origins of the Institute. His anecdotal recollection stands as the widely quoted history of the origins of Rockefeller medical philanthropy. As folklore, it conveys the process and motivations the creator of the Rockefeller Institute wishes us to believe about the germination of his interest. In his retrospective story, Gates describes how the idea for the Institute came to him. As minister of a Central Baptist church in Minneapolis from 1880 to 1888, Gates had countless experiences with regular and homeopathic doctors. His visits to hundreds of sick rooms and his close relations with several physicians confirmed a profound skepticism about medicine of both schools as it was currently practiced. As for homeopathic medicine, he concluded that Samuel Hahnemann, the founder, was little less than a lunatic. He had little more confidence in the regular Orthodox school. Then in 1897, 6 years after joining Rockefeller's staff, he befriended a former member of his Minneapolis congregation who was a medical student in New York. He asked the young man to suggest a readable medical text used in the best medical schools. On his young friend's recommendation, Gates bought himself a copy of William Osier's Principles and Practice of Medicine, first published in 1892, and a pocket medical dictionary. Gates took Osier's books with him to join his family vacationing in the Catskills and read through its approximately 1,000 pages of revelations about the state of medicine. Osier laid bare the limitations of current medical knowledge and practice. Gates learned that many diseases were caused by germs, only a very few of which had been identified and isolated, but many of which we might reasonably hope to discover. When I laid down this book, I had begun to realize how woefully neglected in all civilized countries, and perhaps most of all in this country, had been the scientific study of medicine. I saw very clearly also why this was true. In the first place, the instruments for investigation, the microscope, the science of chemistry, had not until recently been developed. Pasteur's germ theory of disease was very recent. Moreover, while other departments of science, astronomy, chemistry, physics, etc., had been endowed very generously in colleges and universities throughout the whole civilized world, medicine, owing to the peculiar commercial organization of medical colleges, had rarely, if ever, been anywhere endowed, and research and instruction alike had been left to shift for itself, dependent altogether on such chance as the active practitioner might steal from his practice. It became clear to me that medicine could hardly hope to become a science until medicine should be endowed and qualified men could give themselves to uninterrupted study and investigation on ample salary, entirely independent of practice. To this end, it seemed to me an institute of medical research ought to be established in the United States. In July, Gates returned to his office in the Standard Oil building with my Osier in hand and dictated a memorandum to Rockefeller. He laid out his conclusions about the tragic state of medicine in the United States and its immense potential. He pointed out the usefulness of the Koch Institute in Berlin and Pasteur Institute in Paris, and support of his recommendation for an American institute. Gates explained to Rockefeller that Pasteur's discoveries about anthrax and diseases of fermentation had saved for the French nation a sum in excess of the entire cost of the Franco-German War. He also insisted that an institute founded by Rockefeller would encourage other wealthy men and women to found and endow other research centers with a total effort yielding abundant rewards. While the memo to Rockefeller did not result in immediate action, it did provide the coherent rationale 6 months later for opposing the affiliation of Rush Medical College with the University of Chicago, at the time Rockefeller's dearest and largest philanthropy. Rush was a respected school of the regular profession, a follower of the scientific vanguard, but not among them. Gates got Rockefeller's support for a letter urging the university's administrators to abandon Rush and offering them instead a new medical center, magnificently endowed, devoted primarily to investigation, making practice itself an incident of investigation. For some reason, probably related to the influence of Chicago of Rush's wealthy and socially and politically prominent practitioner faculty members, the marriage was consummated anyway. Chicago lost its chance for the proposed institute. Thus was Gates's idea for the institute born and preserved from the clutches of medical sectarianism. Gates's proposal was carefully considered through 1899 and 1900. Gates and Rockefeller Jr., who joined the philanthropy staff in 1897, hired Star J. Murphy, a lawyer friend in Montclair, New Jersey, neighbor of Gates, to study European institutes and confer with leading medical researchers in this country. L. Emmett Holt, a pediatrician to several of Senior's grandchildren and a fellow parishioner at Junior's Fifth Avenue Baptist Church in New York, impressed upon Junior the broad and basic biological research that led to the recent discovery of diphtheria antitoxin. What was needed to solve other great problems in medicine, he told the younger Rockefeller, were men and resources which could be devoted solely to the work of research. Finally, in December 1900, John Rockefeller McCormick, the elder Rockefeller's 3-year-old grandson, fell ill with scarlet fever. On the second day of the new year, he died. Any hesitancy the old man, a follower of homeopathy, felt about endowing scientific medical research was undermined when he was told by respected New York doctors that they knew little about the cause of scarlet fever and had no cure for it. Gates and the Rockefellers were also concerned about competition for their proposed institute. Andrew Carnegie's rival research institute, endowed with $10 million as the Carnegie Institution of Washington in 1902, was then in the planning stages. Rockefeller Jr. was sufficiently concerned about the competition to wring an agreement from the Steel King that his institution would not enter the field of medical research. At the same time, Henry Phipps was founding an institute for the study of tuberculosis in Philadelphia. Competition struck close to home when Rockefeller's daughter Edith and son-in-law Harold F. McCormick unveiled their plans for a tribute to their son, the John Rockefeller McCormick Memorial Institute for Infectious Diseases in Chicago. By 1901, Rockefeller committed himself to funding Gates's proposed institute. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research began its work with $20,000 a year grants to medical researchers and soon thereafter a $1 million gift from Rockefeller. A board of directors composed of physicians, including Holt and Welch, with training in pathology and commitment to bacteriological research, and Dr. Simon Flexner as the executive director. For more than 2 years, Gates grew increasingly impatient as the medical gentlemen restricted themselves to supporting small research projects around the country. Finally, in the fall of 1904, the board opened its first laboratories and began its own program of medical research. In November 1907, Rockefeller gave the institute an additional endowment, but held back half the $6 million requested by the directors. Finally, in October 1910, after the institute was recognized, reducing the board of directors to a lesser role as the board of scientific directors and creating a new board of trustees with Gates as the chairman, Rockefeller added to the institute's endowment, providing it with a yearly income from $6.4 million in investments. By 1920, the Rockefellers had given the institute $23 million, and by 1928, some $65 million. The institute was organized independently of any university, primarily for reasons of efficiency and to avoid conflict with Senior's commitment to homeopathy. First, Gates and Rockefeller Jr. wanted the institute free of any teaching pressures. The objective of the institute was to produce results in medicine in order to reduce the amount of disease in society, and it would be a diversion of resources to ask researchers to teach. Second, the handful of scientific medical schools, while nominally above medical sectarianism, were the turf of regular professions elite. The elder Rockefeller, a lifelong follower of homeopathy, objected to any move that strengthened the regular profession in its conflict with homeopathists. It was undoubtedly on the basis that Rockefeller in 1898 supported Gates's objection to the alliance between the University of Chicago and Rush Medical College, a creature of the regular profession and an opponent of homeopathy. Columbia and Harvard were briefly considered as recipients of the institute, but they were elite regular medical schools. Although neither Gates nor Jr. took the old man's concerns seriously, they had to avoid provoking his objections that they were merely supporting one side, the wrong side in the conflict. With the example of the independent Pasteur Institute before them, the efficiency of a purely research institute as their primary concern, and their desire to assuage seniors' hostility to regular schools, Gates and Rockefeller Jr. agreed to exclude any university affiliation for their project. Homeopathy. The conflict simmers. The conflict over homeopathy continued for some years. It is an illuminating example of the workings of the Rockefeller philanthropies, and it suggests an ideological difference between the robber barons like Senior, who built up industrial empires, and the next generation of corporate capitalists who ran the operations. Rockefeller continued to express his concerns that within the Institute and later in the philanthropies' support for medical education, his money was being used to support the regular profession at the expense of the homeopaths. I am a homeopathist, he scolded his staff in 1916. I desire the homeopathists should have fair, courteous, and liberal treatment extended to them from all medical institutions to which we contribute. In 1919, when he was considering a $45 million gift to his General Education Board to support medical education, Rockefeller again warned his son and staff. Homeopathic teaching should not be excluded. It should be provided for, the same as allopathic. His son and his staff firmly and repeatedly explained that scientific medicine had rendered obsolete the former distinctions between the so-called homeopathic and so-called regular or allopathic schools. The new medicine is free of dogma, free of values. It represents not preconceived notions about the world, but only ascertained facts. Medical science is devoid of medical dogma of any kind. Furthermore, as the homeopaths and regular schools are constantly drawing nearer together, a trusted advisor wrote the old man. The discriminations which formerly were practiced against homeopathists are being constantly lessened. Simon Flexner provided assurances that at the Rockefeller Institute they make no distinction and welcome to their staff qualified men irrespective of the school in which they have been trained. That John D. Rockefeller personally patronized the homeopathists might seem surprising. However, Rockefeller and homeopathy were both products of the 19th century. From the mid-19th century on, homeopathy in the United States appealed primarily to the upper classes. It was safer than the heroics of regular medicine, and it was a sign of affluence and taste since it was very fashionable among the European nobility and upper class, who were aped in many ways by wealthy Americans. Rockefeller, who was 22 at the outbreak of the Civil War, grew up believing that homeopathy was medically and socially desirable. Furthermore, while Rockefeller used chemists and engineers in developing his Standard Oil empire, his chief assets were an unbridled ambition and an intuitive and cunning sense of opportunity and organization. He accumulated the largest fortune among all the robber barons by paying his workers as little as possible and by ruthless methods in the marketplace, extracting huge rebates from the railroads for his shipments and cutting the allopathic was another term for the regular or orthodox sect of medical profession. price of refined oil products to drive up his competitors out of business, he did not fully share his son's and his later manager's appreciation of the importance of science in developing the base of industrial capitalism. In his retirement and devotion to giving away his fortune, Rockefeller generally gave free rein to Gates and his son. He knew that his caution in disposing of his fortune was shared by his trusted lieutenants. Within his philanthropies, he had the money, but did not take the authority to establish policy. It seemed sufficient to him that his name was no longer the object of spittle, but rather gratitude. Except for occasional questions, taciturn consideration of his advisors' requests for millions of dollars, and objections to the treatment of homeopathists, Rockefeller Sr. left the running of his philanthropies and his financial empire alike to Gates and his son. Although Gates and Jr. worked together in developing programs and prying gifts from the occasionally reluctant father, Jr. himself acknowledged that Gates was a brilliant dreamer and creator, and I was the salesman, the go-between with father at the opportune moment. Fortunately for history, Gates was a prolific writer of his ideas, leaving his thoughts in letters to Rockefeller Sr., speeches to various philanthropic boards, and memos to himself and his staff. Given his central role in Rockefeller's philanthropy and the importance of these philanthropies in the development of scientific medicine, it is illuminating to consider Gates's views of the role of consequences of medical science. Scientific medicine and capitalist Gates. Gates, the premier Rockefeller medicine man, was attracted to medical science. It was not the appeals from medical science that drew his interest or his money. He was, like most educated people of the late 19th century, vaguely aware of the march of progress in medicine. He knew of Pasteur and the germ theory of disease. He had read Osier and understood the potential of medical science. But he never heard of Dr. Simon Flexner or Dr. William H. Welch, and he had no contact with other medical scientists until he initiated the Medical Institute. Nevertheless, he did intelligently and clearly see that there was a tremendous need of medical research. Whatever requests for money for medical science crossed Gates's desk, none was taken seriously until 1907, when McGill University asked for aid to replace 2 medical school buildings that had been destroyed by fire. Gates was always an autonomous figure in medical philanthropy. He was moved by his own conceptions of the value of medicine and his own strategies for developing its role in American society. He was certainly influenced by medical men whom he respected, above all Simon Flexner and William Welch. But it was because their ideas and contributions conformed to his plans for the transformation of medicine. What visions did he have of the role and functions of scientific medicine? We may grant that Gates had genuinely humanitarian motivations. His ministrations to the sick and dying in his Minneapolis parish undoubtedly evoked sympathy for their suffering. In his later years, he credited medical science with standing above all other elements of history. None but medicine has done so much to promote all the forces of civilization, to increase human happiness and ameliorate human suffering. Typical of Gates, his enumeration of the accomplishments of medical science places the relief of human misery after the promotion of the forces of civilization. This is not a petty criticism, for Gates's preeminent consideration was the development and extension of Anglo-American civilization. What he understood that civilization to represent will become clear in the following pages. But, in its essence, civilization meant the values of work and disciplined living, a social life organized around productive labor and frugal consumption. Civilization also meant the right and indeed the responsibility of men of wealth to govern society and of industrial societies to direct economically less developed societies. In brief, civilization was equated in Gates's mind with industrial capitalism and imperialism. What value did scientific medicine have for capitalism? Gates envisioned numerous material and social political consequences flowing from medical science in a never-ending stream of support for capitalist society. Healthier workers. The material benefit of medicine is a healthier population and thus a healthier workforce. What Pasteur's work on anthrax had done for the French cattle industry, medical science could do for the whole society. The findings of medical science were most important when applied to preventing disease. By keeping well, Gates observed, a person enjoys all the employments, pleasures, and financial gains of continuous health. Gates insisted from the beginning of his career to its end that the fundamental aim of medical science ought to be not primarily the cure, but primarily the prevention of disease. Gates believed that events supported his contention. In the first quarter of the 20th century, sanitary science and preventative medicine had reduced sickness by half, he asserted, citing support from U.S. Census Bureau reports of mortality rates, insurance company statistics, and reports of state and local health boards. Although sickness was still a major obstacle to the full utilization of labor, the assault by the forces of science was paying off. Gates cited a report that 20% of the employees of large companies were homesick each day, but he added, triumphantly, "I think that even so high a figure is far below that of the armies of General Washington." Gates was far from a solitary figure preaching the potential of medicine for capitalists. Big business, Gates observed in 1925, sponsored preventative medical care programs on a large scale because health is found in a variety of ways to be profitable. Healthy workers are profitable because they are an employer's human capital to be utilized for production of saleable goods and services. Just as the capital invested in machines needs to be protected by adequate maintenance programs, so too does human capital require maintenance and repair, a perspective long recognized in many contexts. Southern slave owners and their physicians viewed their black slaves as a capital investment to be saved from disability or death whenever possible, lending credibility to the myth of paternalistic slavery. In a study of the role of medicine in the antebellum South, Walter Fisher concluded that the primary reason why slaves were provided with medical care was the tremendous economic investment that they represented to slave owners. Every planter understood that to save his capital was to save his Negroes, observed Dr. Richard Arnold, an upper-class physician in Savannah. The self-interest of the slave-owning class in the preservation of its investment made Southern slavery the only institution in which interest and humanity go hand in hand together, Dr. Arnold Riley added. It was not only racism and slavery that facilitated paternalistic self-interest. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, organized in 1861 to provide medical relief to Union soldiers on Southern battlefields, was by its own account no humanitarian enterprise. Run by wealthy Easterners, the commissions declared its ultimate end is neither humanity nor charity. It is to economize for the national service the life and strength of the national soldier. Saving a soldier's life, the commission calculated, reduced the monetary cost of the war and preserved the soldier as a producer when he returned to the industrial pursuits of civil life. Each soldier's life was worth no less than $1,000 to society. With the rapid development of an industrial base in the United States during and after the Civil War, employers in many industries viewed their workers as disposable resources. Particularly with increasing mechanization in industrial production, a decreased demand for skilled workers, and an unlimited supply of desperate immigrants, the workforce became a sea of men and women to be plucked up by employers as needed and later tossed out. Workers who were maimed, killed, or simply worn out by their jobs were replaced by other bodies from among the unemployed. As the unemployed workforce shrank with the outbreak of war or upswings in the economy, as labor organized to change its working conditions and pay, and as employers found that the lost production because of illness and rapid turnover of their workers cost them profits, enlightened businessmen developed new attitudes toward their workers. It was not concern for their workers' needs that led to better conditions and health and welfare programs. Rather, these reforms sprang from the industrial unionism and political organization of workers, and from the opposing necessity of employers to discipline the workforce to the requirements of capitalist production. The firm that improved its working conditions reduced workdays lost to strikes. The firm that took pains to keep its workers found increased productivity from its capital investment. The firm that offered company housing, shares of stocks, and company medical care increased the dependence of the workers on the company and lessened the threat of unionization. And, in the early years of this century up to World War I, industries that voluntarily acted could reduce the risk of restrictive legislation demanded by the forces of progressivism. As early as 1892, following the bloody Homestead strike, Andrew Carnegie articulated a more conciliatory policy towards his workers to prevent the loss of experienced workers, though there is little evidence that he or his company followed the policy. "It is impossible," he said, "to get new men to run successfully the complicated machinery of a modern steel plant." Labor stability became an important element in the productivity and profit strategies of modern industries. "It is good business to conserve life and health," observed John Topping of Republic Steel, "for thereby one of the most important items of economy and production is secured." Industrialists who weathered the marketplace and emerged among the monopolistic leaders of their industry had capital and foresight to ward off unionization and stabilize their workforces with health and welfare programs. Steel companies, railroads, oil companies, and others created completed medical care systems for their workers, hiring or contracting with physicians and providing dispensaries or hospitals. The efforts of slave owners and the U.S. Sanitary Commission to preserve lives by curing disease were aimed at conserving human capital, the only belonging to an individual and other profiting a whole class. The medical programs of individual corporations were aimed more at undermining unionization and stabilizing their own workforces with improved health and added benefit rather than the main purpose. Thus, slave owners and industrial corporations exhibited enlightened self-interest, while the upper-class sanitary commissioners demonstrated a more far-sighted plan for investing in the whole society's workforce. The latter in an articulated interest of an entire class, the interest of the capitalist class in a stable and healthy workforce. Frederick T. Gates consistently articulated this larger perspective and shaped his philanthropic programs around it. He understood that the importance of a healthy workforce to grow into the growth of capital industrial output. The Rockefeller Sanitary